Hey everybody, Billy Obenauer here, continuing our lessons on knowing colleagues, fundamentals of human resource management. In this lesson, we're going to be covering Chapter 11, separating and retiring employees. As we start this unit, I like to explain how important this topic is. And to do that, I'm going to take you back through an example to the first time that I had to fire someone. Okay, I had to fire an employee who was really pretty bad at his job, but was a really good person, really nice person, the kind of person who you totally enjoyed being around and would want to hang out with outside of work. But my boss said it was time for me to learn how to fire somebody. We took the employee back in the office, and I wasn't prepared. I had no notes prepared. I didn't have performance data with me. I just didn't know what I was doing at that moment in time. The employee kept asking questions, and I just kept rambling and rambling and rambling. And he was standing back there saying, I can do better, I can do better. And I was rambling and not explaining a single thing. And this went on for about 10 minutes till finally my boss said, That's it. We don't need your services. You're fired. We're going. And he grabbed me by the arm and pulled me out of the office. And we just left the employee standing there in the office. And I think back to that employee's experience to this day, and I think about how wrong it was the way he was treated and what that experience looked like and the message that that sent to his coworkers when he told them about that experience. And that's a really great example about why it's so important to learn about employee separations and how to handle them properly. Now, there are two types of turnover that we're going to talk about in this lesson. The first type is voluntary turnover, and this is initiated by the employees. So basically, they are volunteering or choosing to leave the organization. Okay, in many cases, the organization would actually like to keep the employees who are leaving. Okay, and employees can choose to leave the organization for a variety of reasons. All right, they may be retiring, they may be moving on to a new opportunity, they may be leaving without a plan because they're just unhappy within the organization. All right, now often what we find is that the employees who are most likely to engage in voluntary turnover are our best employees and our worst employees. All right, and there's a reason for this. When we look at our lowest performing employees over here, they're going to be likely to engage in turnover because they're not going to be happy in their positions. Very few people like doing something that they're not good at, okay? And often poor performance may be indicative of low motivation. So maybe performance is poor because the employees don't like their job, okay? Then we have our top performing employees, our best performing employees. And the reason that they're very likely to turn over is that they're going to be our employees who are going to have the greatest opportunities ahead of them. Okay, so our top performers are going to have the best chance of moving on to something else if they choose to do so. The risk of losing top performers is particularly high in STEM fields, and this is because we have a labor shortage in this area. Now, our top performers in STEM fields play a critical role in our organization's success, so it's crucial that we work to keep them happy and make sure that we can retain them. Now, involuntary turnover refers to a situation where the turnover is initiated by the employer. And this is a situation where often the employees would prefer to stay with the organization. And you may have heard of involuntary turnover referred to as job termination. And there are a variety of reasons that employees may experience job termination. Okay, so perhaps they've engaged in unprofessional conduct in the workplace, maybe they have poor performance, maybe they have some type of safety accident. Okay, and I've had to unfortunately fire quite a few employees over the course of my career for stealing, and sometimes stealing as little as peanuts. Both involuntary turnover and voluntary turnover have costs associated with them. All right, for both types of turnover, we have to worry about recruiting, selecting, and training replacements because we now have openings that we need to fill. Okay, there can also be lost productivity in both cases. Though, if we're looking at involuntary turnover, we would want to ask if the loss of productivity is too great, why are we getting rid of these employees? Now, maybe it's a situation where you have some code of conduct violations like stealing or some other type of inappropriate behavior and you really have no choice but to engage in job termination. But if we're looking at involuntary turnover resulting from poor performance, and then we're dealing with lost productivity, we may want to reevaluate what our standards are for job termination. All right, with involuntary turnover, we can also experience lawsuits, particularly if we're not engaging in this process correctly, and sometimes there can even be workplace violence. Now, in my career, I never experienced workplace violence, but what I would advise is that if you're terminating employees, you want to make sure you're doing it at an hour that there are multiple people available. You may want to have 2 people in the room, and you want to have a situation where the physical layout of the room provides some sort of safety for the person who's engaging in the job termination. Okay, with voluntary turnover, we also have the cost of the loss of talented employees. So remember, often these are people who we don't want to lose, but we have no choice because they've made the decision to exit our organizations. As discussed in Chapter 5, the employment at will doctrine states that either the employer or the employee can end the employment relationship at any point in time unless a contract specifically states otherwise. One exception to this is an implied contract, such as verbal reassurances that someone will not be fired. Another exception is that termination cannot violate the law or public policy. In other words, you can't discriminate against members of protected classes in firing, and you can't fire someone because they refuse to break the law. In order to ensure that our discipline and separation processes are legal and ethical, we should have standardized systems for engaging in discipline and enacting job terminations. These things should not be left solely to the discretion of individual managers, as that allows biases to heavily influence the process. Additionally, when managers and HR partner on these issues, they can more effectively consider multiple perspectives. These processes should be based on justice and the law, while also providing employees with opportunities to improve their performance. So what happens when we don't have standardized processes for employment terminations? Well, I'd like to discuss that through the lens of one of my research papers, Inclusion is Not a Slam Dunk, which was published in the Leadership Quarterly back in 2019. All right, in this paper, we look at employment terminations as we ask the question, what factors influence leadership outcomes when quality of opportunities received by different individuals is similar? Now, as we looked at this question, we looked at the relationship between organizational performance and leadership rewards. We looked at the relationship between performance and employment separation. And then we looked at how a leader's race impacted rewards and separation as well. Then we move forward to take a look at how the leader's race influenced the relationship between performance and rewards and the relationship between performance and employment separation. Now here in this lesson, we're going to be focused on the bottom half of this model because we're focused on employment separations here. So essentially, we're going to be looking at how a leader's race influenced employment separation in this context and how it influenced the relationship between performance and employment separation. Now we examined this question by looking at outcomes for head coaches in the National Basketball Association. And we looked at data from the 2002-2003 season through the 2014-2015 season. Okay, and the reason we chose these years is that 2003 was the first year that all the data that we needed became available, and then 2015 was the last season before we started working on this project. Okay, we only included coaches who coached a complete season because it's really tough to look at how partial seasons impact the outcomes that we were looking at. All right, our final sample size had 335 observations, and as I said, we looked at Coach of the Year voting, and what we care about here in this lesson is we looked at employment separation. All right, we coded the leader's race as either being white or a racial minority. Okay, and some of the performance measures that we looked at were a team's wins, the team's improvement over the previous season, and the success that the team had in the postseason or playoffs. When we analyzed these data, as expected, we found that positive performance negatively influenced the likelihood of employment separation. In the full sample, we did not find that a leader's race influenced likelihood of employment separation. But then we looked at coaches with more time in position. The reason we looked at these coaches is that firing someone in their first year on the job is a pretty transparent process, and people will take notice. We wanted to look at those coaches who people weren't really watching. When we looked at coaches with over 2 years in position, we found that minority coaches had a higher likelihood of separation than white coaches did. Okay, additionally, we found that the benefits of positive performance were neutralized for minority head coaches. This may not make perfect sense to you looking at this table, so let's take a look at a graph. Now here you can see that in our data, for white coaches, as they won more games, their likelihood of employment separation decreased. But for coaches who identified as racial minorities, as they won more games, their likelihood of employment separation didn't change at all. Now you may still be wondering, why did we focus on coaches with more than 2 years of experience? Well, if you look over here, the solid line represents coaches who did not lose their jobs, and the dashed line represents coaches who did lose their jobs. And if we look at the difference in games won between coaches who were fired and coaches who kept their jobs, we can see that in years 1 and 2, this is a pretty big gap. Okay, but then when we get to year 3, this gap gets really small. Okay, year 4 it stays pretty small, year 5 it stays pretty small, and so on. So all of a sudden we see when we get past year 2, there's something else that's influencing these employment separations, but we couldn't quite tell what it was, and that was the question we were trying to answer. Now, people often ask me, what could Adam Silver, the commissioner of the National Basketball Association, take away from my paper? Okay, basically they say, look, you found that after 2 years in position, minority head coaches had a higher likelihood of employment separation than white head coaches did. Well, what could Adam Silver do about that? Well, one of my recommendations would be that even if you can't regulate separations, even if you can't put an official process in for head coaches in this context, you could ask employers to document justifications of separations. So document what the performance actually looked like for each of the employees who were terminated. And by forcing employers to at least look at objective performance data and consider it within the context of termination, we can help to reduce some of the biases that can permeate this process. All right, now let's talk about the principles of justice in employment separation. Okay, and the principles of justice relate to the research that we just discussed, because what we saw in that research was a lack of outcome fairness or distributive justice. And what distributive justice or outcome fairness refers to is consistency in outcomes for different employees. Okay. Another principle of justice is called procedural justice. And this means we have consistent procedures that people go through. So maybe if we're looking to discipline employees and move towards firing, there's a similar process that everybody goes through as they proceed towards that employment termination. All right, and then finally we have interactional justice, and this is just how we treat people through the process. Okay, so even if you are firing somebody, you can still treat them with dignity and respect. You can still talk to them about their positive attributes. You can still be kind to them. Okay, just because we're going through a negative procedure doesn't mean we have to treat people in a negative way. Now, following the principles of justice that we just discussed can help us remain in compliance with legal requirements and avoid wrongful discharge lawsuits. In addition to following the principles of justice, we must be careful not to violate implied agreements such as promises of job security. We also can't violate our company rules. Some states have specific laws that speak to this. As we discussed earlier, we also can't fire people for refusing to break the law. Finally, it's important to ensure that our discipline takes place equitably for all employees, regardless of their demographic identities. Documenting the discipline process can help to protect the organization in the event that anyone takes legal action against the company in response to employment termination. Often, employers look to gather as much data as possible to support discipline and termination, but they should be respectful of employee privacy. Information gathered should be relevant. For example, while you may choose to drug test employees who use heavy machinery if they get into an accident, it might be kind of challenging to justify a drug test for an employee in an accounts payable department. All right, employees can be particularly sensitive to being recorded and should be aware if this is taking place. When I was younger, I once resigned from a position when I found out that conversations were being recorded at my organization without employee consent. We also need to use discretion in terms of who sees the data that we collect. In order to protect employee privacy, it's important that you ensure that information being collected is relevant. For example, if you're conducting email surveillance, yes, you may want to look at emails that are related to company business, but you shouldn't be reading personal emails such as invites to a barbecue. All right. You also want to publicize your information gathering policies and request consent before gathering information. This is going to help ensure that your employees are aware of what your information gathering policies are. All right. We want to make sure that we treat our employees consistently. Okay. We shouldn't have different standards for collecting information on different employees. All right. And finally, you want to conduct your searches discreetly and share information only with those who need it. If you're collecting private information about people, that information needs to remain private, and you can only do that by showing discretion. If the data that we have indicate that discipline is necessary, we may want to engage in a progressive discipline process. And what happens with progressive discipline is essentially that consequences increase with each offense until we finally reach the point of termination. And your book talks about progressive discipline being used for tardiness and absenteeism, unsafe work practices, poor quality of work, theft, and cyber slacking. But I'll be candid with you. I always had a little bit of trouble thinking of progressive discipline as being something we would apply in the situation of theft. And the reason for this is we can't really expect somebody to get a little better at theft or a little better at being honest. So theft can be a little bit problematic. Generally speaking, when I was in industry, if somebody stole from me, they were terminated. Okay, but that was clear in our policies and it was consistent across the board. Whether they stole thousands of dollars or a pack of peanuts, it resulted in termination. Okay, but the most important thing here is that if you engage in progressive discipline, you have to make sure that you follow this process consistently for all employees. So what does progressive discipline look like in practice? Well, it might start with an unofficial spoken warning. Okay, so you just have a conversation with the employee. Make sure they're aware of whatever the problem is. Okay, when I was in the industry, I would use a spoken warning a few different times. Okay, and the reason that I would have a spoken warning a few different times is that once we transition from an unofficial spoken warning to an official written warning, what happens is the relationship between the manager and the employee changes. Okay, we go from the employee feeling like you're a partner here in the spoken category to the employee feeling like you're not on the same team when we get to the official written warning. Okay, so I would generally speaking maybe have 2 or 3 unofficial spoken warnings before I progressed in the process. Okay, but this would be consistent across employees. The other thing that I would recommend here is even though these warnings here are unofficial, you want to make sure that you document them. Okay, have a record of them. And the reason for that is that when you get to the official written warning stage, you can refer back to these unofficial spoken warnings. So you could say, spoke to the employee on this date, and this date. The problem is persisting. The employee is now receiving an official written warning. Okay. Next, after an official written warning, we might go to a second written warning, and maybe there's a threat of suspension in that case, depending on what your company's policies are. Maybe there is a temporary suspension, or we have a final notice that the employee has to improve or they're going to be terminated. Okay, over here I would say is very important that you don't have a double final notice. And what I mean by that is one of the companies that I worked at, they were known for giving people multiple final notices. Well, what happens when people get multiple final notices is they start to not believe that final notices matter. Okay. The other problem with this was that sometimes an employee would get one final notice and other times they would get more than one final notice. So there wasn't really consistency and fairness there either. Okay, and then finally, after your final notice, the final step is going to be termination of the employee. Okay, if you're looking for more information on progressive discipline responses, I would encourage you to check out this video on my YouTube page on McGregor's hot stove rule of discipline. Sometimes we'll engage in employment separations that aren't related to a specific employee, but impact a large number of employees. These typically occur when there is a misalignment between labor supply and labor demand. These types of separations are known as layoffs, and we discussed them earlier in our planning unit. All right, if you must engage in a layoff, the Workers Adjustment, Retraining, and Notification Act requires you to give 60 days notice if you have 100 or more employees, and at least 50 of these employees will be impacted by the layoff. The only penalty for violating WARN, however, is back pay. In other words, if you violate WARN, you may have to pay employees an amount that is equal to 60 days' wages. Now, most of our discussion has focused on involuntary turnover, but voluntary turnover is an important topic to employers as well, particularly because it's something they don't really have control over. Throughout this course, we've talked about the psychological contract, and under the new psychological contract, instead of feeling that employers will be loyal to employees, employees feel responsible for their own career. Because of this, they have lower loyalty towards their employers and can be a higher risk of voluntary attrition or turnover. One way that we can try to reduce voluntary turnover is through the use of alternative dispute resolution to address employee concerns. An example of alternative dispute resolution is an open door policy, which makes managers available to hear employee concerns. For an open door policy to be effective, managers need to buy into it and should have the ability to manage their own availability within reason. When we tell employees that managers will always be available, but then they're not, the employees lose trust in the open door policy. It's critical that employees trust management to be available to hear their concerns and to respond to them appropriately. Another type of alternative dispute resolution is peer review. This method calls for a panel of peers to listen to a dispute and work with individuals to resolve conflict. Mediation is a non-binding process where a neutral party from outside of the organization will hear a case and then work with parties to identify a resolution. All right. And then finally, arbitration is a binding process where a professional arbitrator, who's often a lawyer or judge, hears the case and makes a decision to resolve it. Now, if we don't address our employees' needs, it can impact employee engagement. And this is the degree to which employees are fully involved in their work and the strength of their commitment to their job and their company. Okay, and engaged employees provide us with competitive advantages such as higher productivity, better customer service, and lower turnover. Now, if you're wondering what employee engagement looks like in practice, when we ask our employees about engagement, we ask them to rate their level of agreement with statements such as, "At work, I feel full of energy. My job inspires me, and I get carried away when I'm working." Now, we've had a strong focus on retaining employees, but it's also important that if we do retain our employees, that they're not experiencing job withdrawal. Job withdrawal is a set of behaviors where employees try to avoid the work situation physically, mentally, and emotionally. And some conditions that can contribute to job withdrawal are personal disposition, tasks and roles, supervisors and coworkers, and pay and benefits. All right, now these conditions can help lead to job dissatisfaction, and job dissatisfaction will then lead to job withdrawal behaviors such as behavior change, physical job withdrawal, and psychological job withdrawal. Now we're going to break each of these components down on the upcoming slides. So we're going to start with personal dispositions. And if we go back to chapter 6 when we talked about personality inventories, one of the components we talked about was emotional stability. And employees who are low on emotional stability are more likely to experience job dissatisfaction. All right, we also talked about agreeableness and conscientiousness. And employees who are high on these traits are less likely to experience job dissatisfaction. Okay, other factors that can contribute to job dissatisfaction are negative affectivity and low core self-evaluations. Now, roles also can influence job withdrawal. And when we talk about roles, we're talking about the set of behaviors that people expect of a person in a particular job. So sometimes there's role ambiguity where we don't really know what our expectations are. So we think we're doing our job right, but we're not necessarily sure about it because nobody's really made it clear and we don't have a clear job description. And when we ask questions, we don't get real answers. Sometimes there's role conflict, where there's a conflict between your work and your other roles. So maybe your work is getting in the way of your family, or sometimes you get conflicting directives at work. So maybe you have two bosses and one boss is telling you to do one thing and another boss is telling you to do the opposite. Okay, and then finally we have role overload. And this is where simply we have too many responsibilities. All right, so there's too much work to do and not enough time to do it. Supervisors and coworkers can also contribute to job dissatisfaction and job withdrawal. And when I think about this, I often think about when I was managing a lumberyard and the only rooms that we had in our building that were heated were our bathrooms because we had to make sure the water and the piping didn't freeze. Okay, and in the middle of the winter in upstate New York, it would get pretty cold. And I had one employee who during those cold months spent a lot of time in the bathrooms. Okay, well, that didn't really go over well with all my other employees because they were cold too. Okay, they would have enjoyed having the heaters around them, but they were doing their jobs and they felt like this one person was letting them down. So that coworker's behavior was impacting everyone else's job dissatisfaction at the time. Show me the money! Yes, that's right. Pay and benefits influence job withdrawal. This topic reminds me of when I hired a carpenter at a wage that was about 50% of what he was used to work on my freight team. He was great at first, but he quickly became dissatisfied with his pay and wanted me to show him the money. When I couldn't, he experienced job withdrawal. When employees do experience job withdrawal, they may engage in behavior change, physical job withdrawal, or psychological withdrawal. If they engage in behavior change, we may see them become a little more confrontational than we're used to, or they may try to get back at their employer by holding them accountable in different ways. If they engage in physical job withdrawal, we may see an increase in absenteeism or tardiness. Right? And sometimes employees will resign as well. Right? If they engage in psychological withdrawal, we might see a decrease in job involvement or decrease in organizational commitment. Now, the best way to avoid voluntary turnover or job withdrawal is to increase employees' job satisfaction. Job satisfaction is that positive feeling that we get from our jobs. Okay, and it's actually the best predictor of voluntary turnover that we have today. So what does job satisfaction look like in practice? One of the more common ways of measuring job satisfaction is to ask people 3 questions to rate their level of agreement with these statements. All in all, I'm satisfied with my job. In general, I don't like my job. And in general, I like working here. We can also measure job satisfaction by asking people to identify the face that best describes how they feel about their job in general. All right, one of the challenges with scales like this, however, is that they require people to notice subtle differences in the drawings, such as the difference between 3 and 4 here. We can also use industry-specific scales to measure job satisfaction. So here we have an example where we ask questions about things like recognition and status within the university community, opportunity to pursue scholarly interests, and interactions with students. Or we can measure cognitive aspects of job satisfaction, such as perceptions of being able to keep busy, the chance to work alone on the job, and the chance to do different things from time to time. Alternatively, we can measure affective components of job satisfaction, such as perceptions that others are more interested in their jobs, considering the job pleasant, or being bored with the job. As you can see, there are a variety of different ways that we can measure job satisfaction. And this is important because even though employees in the United States have been fairly satisfied for the last 30 years or so, that satisfaction level differs quite a bit depending on how we're measuring satisfaction. For example, if we're measuring satisfaction based upon the work itself, scores tend to be a lot higher than if we're measuring satisfaction based upon pay. Job satisfaction also varies based upon where we're measuring it. For example, in Mexico, job satisfaction scores are considerably higher than they are in South Korea. There are several actions that organizations can engage in to increase job satisfaction, and I would encourage you to stay to the right of the line that I just drew. Okay, now these are the areas that were outlined by your book, but when they talk about hiring employees who are predisposed to being satisfied, all right, I want you to be careful about discrimination here. Okay, we don't want to discriminate against people because of factors such as depression, because depression could be considered a disability, and it would be us discriminating against members of a protected class. So I would encourage you to stay away from this left box over here because of some of the implications of that. All right, we can make a much bigger impact sticking over here on the right hand side by doing things like setting satisfactory pay levels, communicating pay structure and policies so that employees know what to expect, reinforcing shared values, encouraging social support, helping employees pursue their goals, establishing clear, appropriate roles for our employees, and designing complex, meaningful jobs. We can also work to increase job satisfaction and reduce turnover and tensions of employees through the use of flexible work arrangements. In my research on flexible work arrangements, we had data on 838 information technology professionals in a Fortune 500 company. The data were collected every 6 months for 4 rounds of data collection in 2 different locations. So we were able to look at data over the course of a year and a half and see how people's attitudes changed. Now in this research, we looked at 2 different types of flexible work arrangements. The first one was scheduling flexibility, which involves freedom to take days off, a choice in start and end times, and the ability to take personal phone calls. The second is family supportive supervisor behaviors, which involves being able to talk to a supervisor about work-home conflicts, the supervisor helping to resolve some of these conflicts, and the supervisor organizing work to benefit employees. Now, what we found in this research is that these flexible work arrangements led to a reduction in work-family conflict, which then led to an increase in job satisfaction and overall reduced turnover and tensions. Now, what's really cool about this research is that over the course of the 18 months, we saw that the relationship between flexible work arrangements and turnover and tensions stayed fairly constant. That's why these lines here are fairly flat. All right, and what that basically means is that because those relationships were constant, by changing flexible work arrangements, by increasing scheduling flexibility and increasing family supportive supervisor behaviors, we should have the ability to reduce employee turnover and tensions over time. Now, what all of this tells us is that it's really important to be aware of the satisfaction levels of your employees. And we saw a variety of different ways that we could measure job satisfaction so that we can be aware of satisfaction. We should be collecting this data somewhat regularly and analyzing it so that we can make changes before we lose good people. But when we do lose good people, we want to make sure that we conduct exit interviews so that we can get information that will help us retain others in the future. Thank you so much for joining me. And as we close out here, I just want to say one last thing. I hope that you remember that even though we see a lot of jokes about firing people in the media and in entertainment, firing people is no joke. We are talking about people's livelihoods here, and we need to do everything that we can to avoid having to fire people without good cause. Okay? This is Billy Obenauer here saying, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something, and we'll talk to you soon.